Welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm your host, AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Liam Temple. He's Capuchin Fellow in the History of Catholicism at Durham University. His first book, Mysticism in Early Modern England, was published in 2019, and he has published widely on the influence of the Benedictine monk Augustine Baker and the role mysticism played in early modern English convents. Liam, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So today, you are here to speak about the aforementioned Augustine Baker.
I am, yes.
But before we talk about him, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the academic world of mysticism?
So my interest in mysticism went right back to when I was studying for my master's at Northumbria University in Newcastle. One of my favourite lecturers gave a lecture on medieval English mystics, and I was hooked from then on. He told a great story about how his mother would have a copy of the Imitatio Christi by her bedside every night, and that was a great sort of inspiration for her. So that was one of the first works I looked at. And then he introduced me quite cruelly to the Cloud of Unknowing as an undergraduate. And then from there, it just spread into looking at English mysticism more generally, and then out into mysticism fully.
And how did you settle into the early modern period? What was it about that particular era that intrigued you?
Yeah, I started looking at medieval stuff, and there was a lot less written about the early modern period. So there seemed to be a lot more to actually say in that area. There seemed a lot more undiscovered material that I could look at. And really, that was what excited me moving into a new period after I'd studied for my BA and my MA, looking at something new and refreshing for the PhD.
And what are you working on right now?
So at the minute, my project at Durham looks at the lives of British Capuchins. So that will include one of the quite well-known mystics for the early modern period, who is Bennet of Canfield, who was an Englishman who spent most of his life in France, influencing all the French mystical circles over there that he really had no business being involved in, but was there right at the centre of it. So I'm retracing the history of the Capuchin order in Britain right from the very start, right through to the modern day.
So how did you first come across Augustine Baker?
I started my PhD back to front, basically. I started at the end of the 17th century with lots of Protestant authors that were talking about mysticism and trying to figure out where they got this information from. And some of them were citing Augustine Baker. And then I sort of worked my way back and ended up falling into this complete trap of Augustine Baker studies, where he's wrote so many different manuscripts and so many different works. I didn't really appreciate at the time, I think, how much he'd written. So that's how I found Augustine Baker in the first place, was sort of working my way backwards, oddly from Protestant sources, and ended up looking at a Benedictine monk at the start of the 17th century.
So what kinds of things was he writing then, and who was he writing for?
He wrote specifically for the nuns that he was spiritual advisor for at Cambrai, and a lot of his early material is to do with mysticism and spirituality and advising the nuns on what they should be reading, how they should view mysticism. And he basically generates an entire cottage industry out of writing for these nuns, because the amount of material that he creates is unbelievable. I haven't counted it personally, but the last count was over 1 million words across his entire manuscript corpus. So he writes a lot of material very quickly as well. Unbelievably, in the space of about 5 or 6 years, he produces just this wealth of material on mysticism that's really unbelievable.
That is a lot of words. I'm kind of ashamed of my own word count goals now.
He sets a bad example.
A horrible example, completely unrealistic. So if most of his writing is guidance for other people, then what do we know about him, and where is that information coming from?
Yeah, so we know quite a lot about Baker from his followers. So there's lots of different manuscript lives that have been written about him. He has a very devoted following in the 17th century in Benedictine convents, and there's lots of struggles over his manuscripts and over his writings. So we know quite a lot about him. A lot of those works are very hagiographical, so they portray him almost as a saint. They talk about him as the Venerable Augustine Baker, even though he's not at that level yet. So there's a lot of different things going on in these manuscripts about his life. But we know the basics about his life: when he was born, how he grew up. But a lot of that material is wrapped up in presenting him as a saint, basically.
Okay, great. Give us the details.
So he was born in 1575 in Wales, and he was born into a family of what his autobiographers describe as church papists. So basically, Catholics that went to Protestant services and Protestant churches, but still believes themselves to be Catholic and still believe that what they were sitting and listening to in church was essentially Catholic light. So he was trained as a lawyer in London, and that was in 1596. And then the accounts of his life talk about him as basically turning into an atheist of some sort, because he trains as a lawyer, he's in London, he's very worldly driven. This is where you start to see what his followers are doing. He's gambling, he's stealing, he gets in with the wrong crowds. So he has this life of what they call atheism, but it probably just means not going to church, essentially living a bad life. And then he has this fantastic episode in 1600 where he's traveling across a river, and his autobiographers say he's distracted by worldly thoughts, and he gets stuck in this river. Basically, he's on horseback, he gets stuck on this tiny little bridge, can't go forward, he can't go back. He thinks he's basically gonna die, he's gonna drown. And he says, if God will save me, then I'll devote my life to God. And then straight away, he's saved. The horse sort of gathers itself, gets him across this river. And after that, he thinks, right, okay, I'm going to be Christian again. I'm going to follow whatever God wants me to do because I've been saved by divine providence, essentially. So he has this very bizarre moment of divine intervention on his way traveling. And then after that, not unusually for the period, he reads himself into becoming a Catholic, because at this stage in the early 1600s, the Catholic missions sort of haven't gathered themselves yet back into England and Wales. So he is essentially reading Catholic works and reading himself back into the church because there's no one there to really help him do that. And a lot of what his biographers say is that he's converted by works of mysticism. So he starts to read spiritual works by Catholics and thinks, this is what I'm after, this is what I'm interested in. So yeah, he has a very weird and wonderful and interesting early life. How much of that is being egged on by his followers, I'm not quite sure, but we know the basics and we know quite a lot about his early days.
So his conversion experience is very much a tit for tat kind of deal, like, help me out and then I'm yours.
Yeah, basically, yeah. He has that moment of, if you save me, I'll do whatever you want and I'll follow whatever calling you give me. And originally he thinks that he's being called to a life of complete sort of isolation as a monk. He should be retiring from the world. And then once he becomes a Benedictine and thinks he's going to get that life, then he gets called in a totally different direction and just ends up not having that life whatsoever.
Okay, so if he doesn't get this life of isolation, what does he get?
So Baker starts his journey to becoming a Benedictine in 1605. So he becomes a Benedictine novice. And then he gets involved very quickly in this argument about the English Benedictine congregation. So they're trying to reform the English Benedictines as a separate congregation entirely on their own. And there's lots of debate about whether this is legal and whether there's any continuation from the pre-Reformation Benedictines. And basically this guy who has trained as a lawyer but wants to go and live essentially a life of isolation is too good a resource for these Benedictines not to use. So they send him basically across all the libraries and archives in England, and they say, right, you're a lawyer, you have these skills, build up a defense for us that shows that the English Benedictine congregation is a legitimate congregation and therefore should have all the rights that entails. So he, for someone who thinks he's called by God to a life of isolation, ends up back in England, actually probably socializing with more people than he did before, gathering these manuscripts and all these different resources to that end goal of securing the English Benedictine congregation. And then after that, after he sort of tries to retire again, he's then called to help the nuns at Cambray. So he still doesn't get his wish. And that's where he ends up producing all these works of mysticism and finding his rhythm, I guess.
So what does Baker's mysticism look like? What kind of mystic is he?
So there's two types of mystics, he says. There's either those that write about mysticism, and there's those that practice mysticism, or those that attempt to achieve mystical experience. So he very much sees himself as the first category. So he is a writer who advises about mysticism. So he talks about mystical union, about contemplation, about how you might want to achieve that. But he is very much someone who says, go away and try this. That's not for me to do myself. I'm just advising you. You can, in your own time and your own way, you do that. So then obviously he saw the nuns as the second category. So those are the ones that were actually achieving mystical union and practicing mysticism. And he was just the one that was encouraging them along, basically. He was giving them a prod in the right direction. There's some autobiographical material in one of his works that says that he'd attempted to have this sort of mystical contemplation himself, and he'd fallen into periods of just complete desolation afterwards, just didn't know what to do, thought he wasn't good enough, thought he hadn't been chosen to that path, and hadn't realized that actually a lot of mystical writers talk about that period of spiritual desolation as part of the process. So he sort of devotes himself to saying, right, I'm not going to let the nuns go the same way. I'm going to give them all the advice they need. I'm going to draw on every single possible work I can find and really build up this wealth of resources for the nuns so that they don't go the same way I do, that they don't basically think that they're not called to this way of life, because they are.
So he's not striving for mystical union, but he is advising others on how to do so? Where is he getting all this information if it's not from his own experiences?
So what he does is he's obsessed in a way with talking about mystics and mystical authors. And I've argued it, and other scholars have argued it as well, that he's probably the first writer in English to refer to mystics as mystics. So he builds that canon himself. So he talks about this great tradition through Christianity, and that's what he's interested in doing. So he gathers up as many books, printed on manuscript as he can. He builds libraries for the nuns. He has reading lists. It's almost like homework for the nuns, basically. He has all these fantastic resources that he's building up. And because he's so well read, I guess, I think it's his lawyer background that he just has this way of writing these manuals of instruction that he just fires out so quickly. But yeah, that's where he gets it from. He's sort of translating mystical works. He's writing them himself, but a lot of his work is based on sort of stitching together earlier mystical works or contemporary mystical works into something new that the nuns can understand. So he's basically a node. He's just sort of communicating everything for them. And we do get little snippets of his own experience that he did attempt it at certain points across his early life, but he was insistent that it wasn't about him, that it wasn't about his experience, it was about the nuns' experience. It's very profitable for the nuns. We have lots of accounts of those nuns going on to record their experiences. Yeah, so a really fruitful time with the nuns at the convent. But yeah, not a mystic in the traditional sense, but he would see himself as one because he sees the sort of spiritual confessor, spiritual advisor role as being part of that process.
So how does all that information gathering translate into practical advice? What kinds of things does he tell the nuns to do?
Baker would start by basically saying, read as much as you can. So read existing works, but when you start your prayers and you start to sort of ascend this mystical ladder, don't be held back by what you've read. It's a really fantastically sort of individual way of going about it, and it gets him in lots of trouble with all the authorities because he's basically giving these nuns the reins and saying, just go for it. You know, I'm guiding you, but at some point, everything I've said and everything that these works of mysticism have said will just not be needed anymore because God will take over. You know, it will be written in your hearts and your soul. He describes the nuns as a tabula rasa, so a blank slate. And that's upon which God will write his own sort of message and his own communications. And that's where they should aim for. It shouldn't be that they're just following his direction. But he has some very traditional, I guess, views about what mysticism is. So he talks about, for example, the intellectual and the spiritual paths, which he talks about scholasticism a lot because he's a lawyer. He talks a lot about worldly knowledge can only get you so far. Certain types of prayer can only take you so far. And eventually you'll replace the intellectual with the spiritual or the mystical and then ascend from there. So he has this very traditional sort of cloud of unknowing inspired mysticism where it's all about darkness and unknowing and forgetting and trying to reach a God who is essentially unknowable and indescribable. It's a very well thought out system, but he distills it very well for the nuns so that they can use it however they wish.
Can you share some of this advice with us? Can you give us an example of the kind of things that he wrote?
Okay, so this is a quote from Secretum, which is Baker's commentary on the Cloud of Unknowing. And in typical Baker style, it's neither just a commentary or any other type of work. It's a bit autobiographical. It's a bit of mystical theology. It's a bit of advice for the nuns. And I picked this quote because it really gives you a sense of Baker's style and his complete disdain for commas and full stops. So this is from Secretum, and the quote goes like this: "It is most profitable and necessary for a soul that desires to attain to the perfect love of God, that she seriously and courageously resolve and prepare herself, both as to her exterior and interior, to pursue and follow God and his love by all those ways, strange or vulgar, known or unknown, heard or not heard of, understood or not understood, consolations or desolations, light or darkness, prosperity or adversity, health or sickness, temptations or freedom from temptations, riches or poverty, by which his divine goodness and providence shall be pleased to guide her, holding on in these ways till she comes to the way which is without all end, where his grace at length bring us to his own honour and our eternal happiness. A long and winding quote by Augustine Baker.
So what is he trying to say there? Just, you will be guided in some fashion.
Yeah, essentially. And I mean, Baker writes these fantastic passages where he says there's so many different ways that mysticism can occur. And he just basically puts the word mystic in front of anything. So mystic smells, mystic visions, mystic sight, mystic feelings, anything that he can think of will have happened. And he has this brilliant way of saying, look, if you read something in a previous mystical work that doesn't make sense or doesn't pertain to your experience, don't worry, it's just probably because it's not been translated properly. Or even better, if you're going to do the theological answer, it's because what they're experiencing can't be put into words properly. So there's this fantastic sort of umbrella idea that he's got going on here of everything can be included because there's nothing that can be criticised. If you think, oh, that's not quite right, don't worry about it. That was their specific experience, or it wasn't translated, or it's because the mystical experience can't be explained. So he has this brilliant way of collecting all these works and connecting them all together.
I love that. You know, if you don't understand it, don't worry. It's ineffable. You're not supposed to.
And in some ways, that's good that you're identifying that because you're understanding how mysticism works then. That your experiences then won't be the same as someone else's and they might not understand them. And that's, of course, a really brilliant excuse when he starts to get in trouble for some of these views. Because a lot of the time he just falls back on the you don't understand what's going on because you're not yourself a mystic. So that's a brilliant sort of fallback excuse to use. But yeah, that's his line of argument there.
I mean, that's one way to handle your critics. Just dismiss them out of hand as being completely ignorant of what's going on.
Yeah, Baker does a lot of that. He calls them scholastics. He uses this as a shorthand for anyone that would criticise mystical experience. And he's got a lot of axes to grind. So he has a lot to say about the state of learning in the early modern period in the 17th century. He's got a lot to say about the direction of spiritual direction. So he doesn't particularly appreciate the fact that the Jesuits are starting to edge in on lots of these convents and take over the spiritual direction of the nuns. And he sees they're very meditation focused, the spiritual exercises. He says they're not suitable for nuns. You know, they're very worldly, very practical things that the Jesuits would do on the mission. And if they're being taught in the convents, that's not what the convent is for. The convent is a place of retreat. It's a place for contemplation and ultimately for mystical experience. So, yeah, anyone who criticizes him is a scholastic and very worldly and is basically treading down the wrong path, which is a brilliant way of just discrediting people.
It's an interesting contrast that he was so well educated and had kind of this worldly life, and then he is so disdainful of that for other people.
Yeah, and I mean, that's probably part of it, that he had this worldly life, that he was so well educated and yet was so far from Christ and Christianity that he'd fallen so far, and it was only because of this divine providence that he'd been saved. So I think that's where his axe to grind comes from. He's had that classic experience that he didn't want the nuns to then replicate. And it's a weird way that he talks about scholastics and knowledge. He's very keen to say he's so well educated to make sure that the nuns aren't ever sort of tempted to do that. He talks about the nuns as just being simple souls. And I think he finds, as is probably classic across lots of different accounts of mysticism, that women and particularly nuns were very well suited to mysticism. It's that classic thing that because they're enclosed, because they're in these monastic communities, they are the perfect subjects to focus on mysticism and they're not distracted by the outside world and worldly knowledge. And I think he sees a lot of what's happening across some of the convents as that going the wrong direction, that the nuns are starting to be taught by people who are very worldly and have no idea about mysticism. He's not critical of the Jesuits in their entirety. He thinks they have a place on the mission and that they're very good at what they do. He just doesn't think that they're right for the nuns and that the nuns should be focusing on mystical contemplation rather than anything less than that.
So he's all about reinforcing the importance of a quiet, contemplative life.
Yeah, he's drawing on all those things and he's saying that this is the ultimate aim of the Christian life. This is the highest life you can achieve. Why would you want to do anything less? You've been called to a life of isolation and contemplation and reflection. Why would you then not spend your time trying to achieve the ultimate Christian goal, which is knowledge and experience of God? So that's where he sees the nuns as sitting, and he is just there to facilitate.
Okay, so you've told us about his life up until he arrives in Cambrai and the kind of things he writes for the nuns while he's there. But does he spend the rest of his life there, or is there more biography to tell?
Part of Baker's life is he just wanders into trouble wherever he goes. He's just fantastic. So he goes to Cambrai in 1624. He's lodged there as a sort of spiritual advisor, so he's not the confessor for the convent. So he's just there to help, basically. But over time, he proves so popular that he has this sort of following of nuns that would go to him for advice. And he really starts to get in trouble with the convent confessors, who start to feel very put out by what's going on here. So within a couple of years, there is complaints to the English Benedictine congregation that he has his own sort of grouping, his little secret cult following within the convent. And he has lots of debates with the convent confessor, who's called Francis Hull, over who is right, who should be giving spiritual direction. And Baker particularly doesn't like Francis Hull because he sees him as bringing in a lot of Jesuit practices. So there's these fantastic manuscript accounts of the nuns and Baker writing these apologies for their doctrines or attacking Francis Hull. And they're really interesting to read because it is just a full-on defense of mysticism in a way that I don't think, at least in the English language, had ever been seen before. They were really building up their case for what should happen. And then in 1633, both him and Francis Hull are sent away from the convent. They're bickering that much. They write to the English Benedictines. Francis Hull accuses Baker of having this spiritual confederacy. He has this secret group and they're reading books and they're not authorized and they're circulating manuscripts. And Augustine Baker, with the nuns in turn, turns around and says Francis Hull is basically making himself pope in the convent. He's making himself a king or a ruler. So there's these fantastic accounts. And it's great for Baker because he sees what's happening much wider, happening in his convent. So he says, well, look, this is the worldly practices coming in. And this is people not understanding mysticism and attacking it. And just as it's happening out there in the world, in Christianity in general, it's happening in this convent. It's happening in micro, right in front of me. So yeah, he gets sent away from the convent in 1633 and then ends up back at Douay or Dowie, depending on how you pronounce it, which is English Benedictine monastery, and then causes even more trouble there. He finds male followers instead who come to see him, talk about his works. And in the end, I think the English Benedictine congregation just gets sick of him causing so much trouble that they send him back into England in 1638. Right at the height of anti-Catholicism in England, they say, we think you need to go on the mission. We think you need to be in England, despite the fact that he is so old and he's 63-year-old and he's so frail. And it's basically a death sentence. There's no other way of putting it. And then a couple of years later, in 1641, he dies. But that's just Augustine Baker through and through. He seems to just court controversy wherever he goes. It doesn't matter if he's with the nuns or he's with the Benedictine monks. And then once he's back in London, he's dodging people who are chasing Catholics and hunting down missionaries. So yeah, an interesting life from start to finish, but lots of controversy and a really sort of divisive figure in the congregation's history as well.
But despite all of this controversy, he gains a following who then write about him and their own experiences and circulate all these works. Can you tell us a little bit about who's doing that work?
He has lots of different followers. So the nuns are obviously his main followers. And he has a couple of specific nuns. Gertrude Moore is one, and then Margaret Gascoigne is another nun. And they actually write down their experiences and he edits them himself. And those are the sort of works that circulate. He has lots of manuscript copies of his works. So there's a cottage industry there in itself of the nuns and some of his male followers as well, just copying his works down and circulating them in the convents. And what's really interesting is I don't think we actually have an autographed copy of a work by Augustine Baker that survives. I think everything we have are copies made by the nuns or by his male followers, because obviously lots of these works are seized and destroyed during the French Revolution. And I'm hoping, and lots of scholars are hoping, that they're sat in an archive somewhere in France that just hasn't been acknowledged yet. So there's lots of manuscript copies of his work circulating. And then he has male followers, and there's lots of leading Catholic families that these nuns and these monks have come from that then ask for copies of the works, so they're circulated. But it's his manuscripts that really generate his following. And that's what the Benedictine congregation eventually gets very nervous about, because there's so many copies of his works circulating. And the original copies were sort of authorized and approved, but as time goes on, there's just so many unauthorized copies of these things going around that they start to get a little nervous about the message and the meaning, and whether some of them should actually be taken back and seized and revised, let's say, for what they say and how much authority they give the nuns. So there's lots of manuscript works, and then we have lives written by his followers, one by a nun, but mainly by his male followers, some of whom were alive at the same time as Baker, and some of them knew him directly and were sort of there and witnessed events. Some were written by very, very enthusiastic and loyal disciples, and you get that in the works, that they are just Bakerites. They really love him. And then there's works written by Benedictine monks that never met him. And actually, one of the most important works written was by a Benedictine monk called Serenus Cressy, who gathers all of Baker's works together and then publishes them in 1657 in a work called Sancta Sophia, and has the impossible task of trying to distill 1,000,000 words down into something that you can actually publish. So just cuts and butchers away everything he's written to get it down to, I think it's about 250,000 words, I think, in the end. And that's how his works were mainly remembered, was this published edition that comes out much later on after his death, almost 20 years after his death.
Does that edition come with more full stops and commas?
Sadly not. Sadly, it's still full of big sentences. There's been a lot of work done on whether Sancta Sophia is Augustine Baker's work or if it's half Augustine Baker and half Cressy, because you take so much away and you cut so much out that it's whether it's actually Baker that's left. But yeah, that was the way that Augustine Baker was known for hundreds of years, was through Sancta Sophia, through this published work. And it's only in the last 30 or so years that people have actually gone back and looked at his manuscripts and actually rediscovered that he had a lot more to say, not very clearly sometimes with the lack of punctuation, but he had a lot more to say than we've actually given credit for in the first place.
So what's the overarching message of all of his work? Is it just that mysticism exists and nuns should be practicing it?
Yeah, in a way. So that's his main message, is read as much as you can. Don't be afraid to engage with works of mysticism written previously, but also that you are a living, breathing part of that tradition, which is a new tradition that he has just crafted himself together from different works. That's his main advice. But obviously, once it's published, it's open to a much wider audience. And people have found inspiration from this that aren't nuns, that have just looked at it and thought this is a great source of Christian doctrine, Christian spirituality. So his writing did have wider applications for anyone interested in mysticism, but his main goal in his manuscripts, at least, was to advise and guide these nuns. And really he was just possessed by this purpose to write as much as he could for them. And you see when he leaves the convent with all the controversy, some of the works that he writes later on before his death just don't have the same energy, they don't have the same impact, because he's not writing for them. He starts to write for monks, and I think he goes back into his lawyer scholar mode and just writes some stuff that is interesting, but is nowhere near as passionate and as driven as what he's doing early on. So I think he sees his role in mysticism as being his second chance to write what was done to him early in his life when he didn't have access to all this material and this framework, and missed his chance, I think, to become a mystic, to really make sure that the nuns and anyone else really following his doctrines didn't do that and was supported and had enough information and had enough access to resources to achieve that goal.
I don't think we get enough examples of people living vicariously through nuns, but it's nice that they had such a supportive and enthusiastic spiritual advisor. We are coming to the end of the podcast now, which means we have the one main question, which is, why is Augustine Baker your favorite mystic?
Because he's just such an unbelievably difficult figure to pin down a lot of the time. I mean, a lot of people have done work on Baker and they've sort of pinched little bits of his work to talk about, and no one's really attempted to read it all before. And I just think there's this brilliant character under these words of someone who is so passionate, so driven, so determined to help these nuns, seems to have found his calling really with the Benedictine nuns and helping them, but also someone who is, to his probably his very last breath, so just awkward and up for confrontation and ready for conflict at any point. So just you get this figure that just doesn't fit with a lot of what's going on around him and isn't afraid to really just tell people what he thinks about what's going on. But at the same time, I mean, I've joked about the way he writes, and he does write like a lawyer, just write in very sort of long sentences, but there is some very beautiful material in there, and especially the material that then is produced by the nuns themselves. So there's accounts written by Gertrude Moore, for example, that are just brilliant and are just really sort of beautifully written. And that's why I study him so much. That's why I like him so much. And that's why I'm obsessed with his legacy and writing more about him, because I think more people should acknowledge that he is such an interesting character.
Well, he's obviously a multifaceted and fascinating character. Liam, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Augustine Baker. I have put a link to your book, Mysticism in Early Modern England, into the show notes so that everyone can check it out and read more of your work. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic and join me next time when I speak to Lydia Shahan about Hadwick.